The jungle was quiet in a way that made men nervous, because silence like this never lasted long on Pacific Islands, where every rustling leaf could mean death and every shadow might hide an enemy who'd been waiting for hours with inhuman patience. A US Marine crouched in a shallow foxhole, sweat dripping down his neck despite the early morning chill, listening to insects buzz their relentless song and distant waves crash against coral beaches while knowing with absolute certainty that unseen eyes were watching every move he made. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the dense trees and scattered rubble from previous artillery barrages, Japanese snipers waited with the kind of patience that Western soldiers found almost supernatural. Their rifles steady against sturdy branches, their fingers calm on triggers, their breathing controlled and measured, ready to kill the next American who made even the smallest mistake. This Marine had already seen firsthand what those snipers could do, because for days they'd pinned his entire unit down in positions that offered little protection, shooting anyone who lifted a head or shifted position carelessly, turning every single step forward into a deadly gamble with death that could come from any direction at any moment. The Japanese were absolute experts at this particular kind of fighting, trained from the earliest days of their military service to disappear into the land itself, to become one with the terrain, to wait for hours or sometimes even days for one clean shot that would justify their patience. They'd fought this way across every contested island in the Pacific Theater, and it worked brilliantly, spreading paralyzing fear through American ranks and slowing every advance to an agonizing crawl. He was just 20 years old, impossibly far from his home in rural America, physically exhausted from weeks of constant combat, mentally drained, burning with anger at an enemy he couldn't see, and tired beyond words of watching his friends bleed out in the tropical heat because someone had blinked at the wrong moment or moved a fraction too quickly. His officers had tried absolutely everything they could think of to counter the sniper threat, firing blindly into trees whenever they heard shots, sending wide flanking patrols through terrain that was almost impassable, calling in mortar strikes when they could get fire support. But the snipers always seemed to survive somehow, melting back into the jungle like ghosts and reappearing somewhere else to resume their deadly work. Quick thing before we continue, hit subscribe if you want more incredible WW2 stories like this, because we dig into moments you won't hear about anywhere else. The kind of stories that textbooks skip over but that show you what war was really like, and you'll definitely want to be part of this community we're building. What made this particular story absolutely insane wasn't some revolutionary new weapon fresh from American factories or some brilliant secret plan hatched by high-ranking officers studying maps in comfortable headquarters, but rather a simple trick that used the enemy's own legendary patience and discipline against them in a way nobody had really tried before, and in just 4 days of implementation, it would leave 31 Japanese snipers dead and fundamentally change how this Marine unit approached jungle warfare. The Japanese sniper positioned somewhere in the canopy above had every reason in the world to feel supremely confident in his abilities and his position, because by 1942 the Imperial Japanese Army had turned jungle warfare into something approaching a deadly art form, using natural cover, elevation advantages, and absolute stillness to completely dominate American troops who simply weren't used to fighting this particular way. They climbed high into trees well before dawn broke, carefully wrapped their rifles in vegetation to hide any metal shine that might give away their position, and then stayed completely motionless through suffocating heat, torrential rain, and swarms of biting insects, knowing from hard-won experience that the first man to move in any engagement usually died before he could get off a shot. Many young Marines had learned this brutal lesson the hard way, discovering that standing up even for a single second could mean a high-velocity bullet through the skull, and that pervasive fear slowed entire units down to an absolute crawl, making every advance a nightmare of tension. The Americans certainly had better numbers than the Japanese defenders on most islands, and they definitely had access to more firepower from naval guns and air support. But absolutely none of that overwhelming material advantage mattered when you fundamentally couldn't see who was shooting at you from concealed positions, and every gunshot echoed and bounced off trees without giving away any clear position that you could return fire on effectively. Even worse for American morale and tactical planning, Japanese snipers typically worked in coordinated pairs or small groups, carefully covering each other's positions and potential escape routes. So even if you got lucky and managed to kill one of them, it didn't end the immediate threat because his partner was already drawing a bead on your position. The jungle itself became a malevolent enemy in its own right, a green hell hiding determined men who absolutely refused to give up ground willingly or retreat according to any Western military logic. What this particular young Marine understood through a combination of observation and pure survival instinct was elegantly simple in concept, because snipers, no matter how well trained or how patient they might be, had one fundamental weakness they simply couldn't avoid no matter what. They had to fire their weapons to kill enemy soldiers, and firing meant revealing position, even if only for a split second. He carefully took a spare helmet from a dead soldier who didn't need it anymore, slid it onto the end of a sturdy stick he'd cut from nearby bamboo, and then slowly, deliberately raised it just above the edge of his foxhole, moving it with just enough natural motion to look convincingly real, like an actual Marine carefully standing up to look around and assess the tactical situation. The effect was instant and almost predictable. A sharp crack echoed through the trees as a rifle fired. The helmet jerked violently backward from the impact of a 7.7mm bullet, and the Marine instantly marked the direction with calm focus born of desperation, not panicking but carefully noting exactly where the shot had originated from based on sound and the angle of impact. Within mere seconds, multiple rifles from his unit opened up in disciplined fire, pouring concentrated volleys into the exact spot where the telltale muzzle flash had briefly appeared among the foliage. When the coordinated shooting finally stopped and the jungle began to settle back into its usual rhythms, there was absolutely no return fire from that position. The sniper was either dead or too wounded to continue fighting. The jungle went eerily quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less oppressive, more like an opportunity. It wasn't just blind luck, and it definitely wasn't a one-time trick that would only work once before the enemy adapted to the new threat. Because this Marine did it again in a different location, and then again from yet another angle, and then again and again throughout the day, each time carefully moving to a fresh position before raising the decoy, each time deliberately tempting a sniper who believed with absolute conviction that patience and discipline would ultimately win this deadly game of cat and mouse. Over the course of hours, then stretching into days of repetition, the helmet rose and fell in different sectors of the American line, and every single time it made its appearance, another previously hidden shooter gave away his carefully concealed position and ultimately his life for one clean shot that never actually hit living flesh or drew real American blood. The Japanese snipers simply couldn't help themselves, couldn't overcome their own training and instincts, because everything they'd been taught in their military instruction told them to take the shot the instant a good target appeared, to strike fast with precision and then vanish into cover before the Americans could effectively react with their superior numbers. But this clever Marine didn't react blindly or spray bullets randomly into the jungle canopy like so many frustrated soldiers before him had done. Instead, he watched with predatory focus, waited with patience that matched his enemies, and learned their patterns, seeing subtle details like how specific branches shook differently depending on where the shooter was positioned, how dust and debris jumped when a rifle fired, how sound carried and echoed differently depending on exact distance and height in the layered jungle canopy. Other Marines along the defensive line caught on remarkably fast to this innovative tactic, because absolutely nothing boosts unit morale quite like seeing an enemy who'd terrified you for days suddenly exposed and vulnerable to counterattack. Soon enough, multiple helmets mounted on sticks appeared at various points along the American line, popping up from different angles and at irregular intervals, forcing the remaining Japanese snipers to make difficult choices about which targets to engage while American riflemen stayed completely ready, eyes locked intently on the most likely firing points, fingers on triggers, waiting for that telltale muzzle flash. Some of the smarter or more experienced snipers recognized the pattern developing and tried to wait longer before taking their shots, hoping the Americans would lose patience or assume the position was clear. But the relentless pressure of being actively hunted, combined with hunger, thirst, and the psychological strain of knowing they were now the prey instead of the predators, gradually wore down even the most disciplined soldiers. When they finally made the decision to fire, perhaps driven by desperation or orders from officers who didn't understand the changed tactical situation, it immediately sealed their fate, bringing concentrated return fire that they simply couldn't survive. Other snipers attempted to relocate to entirely new positions under cover of darkness or during the confusion of artillery barrages, but movement itself betrayed them in the close confines of jungle warfare. Whether it was a snapped twig that carried farther than expected in the humid air, a shifted shadow that an alert Marine spotted against the filtered sunlight, or an unfortunate glint of metal from a rifle barrel or scope that caught someone's eye at exactly the wrong moment. Over the course of 4 intense days of this new tactical approach, 31 Japanese snipers died in this methodical fashion, not because the Americans had suddenly transformed into better marksmen overnight or received some new wonder weapon from the factories back home, but simply because one resourceful young Marine had taken the time to understand exactly how his enemy thought, how they'd been trained to fight, and what fundamental weaknesses that training created. He didn't need fancy gear shipped from the States, didn't need new orders from higher headquarters, didn't need anything except a spare helmet, a sturdy stick, and patience that matched his enemy's legendary discipline. The numbers involved mattered enormously in practical terms, because every single sniper killed meant significantly fewer sudden deaths among American troops, fewer units pinned down helplessly in exposed positions, fewer delays in forward movement, and most importantly, more confidence among the regular soldiers to actually move forward and take ground instead of cowering in fear of invisible enemies. The psychological effect of this simple tactic spread rapidly beyond just one position or even one company, as Marines shared the helmet trick up and down the entire regimental line, turning paralyzing fear into focused determination and seething frustration into concrete action that moved the battle forward. One Marine who served in that same sector later wrote in his personal journal that the jungle felt fundamentally different after those 4 days of counter-sniper operations. Not exactly safe because nowhere in the Pacific Theater was truly safe, but noticeably less alive with the constant sensation of unseen eyes watching your every move, as if the enemy's suffocating grip on the battlefield had finally loosened just enough to let exhausted men breathe again without feeling that crushing pressure. He wrote that the helmet trick didn't magically make anyone brave or fearless, didn't turn them into the kind of heroes you see in propaganda films, but it gave them back a measure of control over their own survival, and in the desperate context of jungle warfare, having any control at all often meant the difference between living and dying. This kind of innovative tactical thinking didn't come from official training manuals printed in Washington or from instructional films shown to recruits in boot camp, because it emerged directly from raw desperation, from being completely tired of watching friends die in exactly the same way day after day, and from the crucial realization that even the best trained soldier develops predictable habits that can be exploited. The Japanese snipers were undeniably deadly, impressively disciplined, and highly skilled at their craft, but they were also ultimately human beings, and human beings instinctively react to what appears to be opportunity, especially when they've been trained their entire military careers to seize such moments instantly. By the time the fighting finally moved on to the next objective and this particular stretch of jungle was left behind, the Marine who'd started this whole tactical innovation never saw himself as any kind of hero deserving of medals or recognition, because to his practical mind it was just common sense applied under pressure in a place where common sense and quick thinking kept you alive another day. He didn't spend time counting enemy bodies or bragging about the impressive numbers his idea had achieved, because his attention was already focused entirely on the next ridge that needed taking, the next tree line that might hide more enemies, the next deadly stretch of contested ground that might very well kill him before this whole terrible war finally ended. Years later, when military historians analyzed Pacific campaign tactics, they would point to this specific story as a textbook example of small unit adaptation under fire, demonstrating how American troops learned incredibly fast in the brutal Pacific Theater, adjusting their tactics literally day by day against a determined enemy who absolutely refused to fight by any familiar rules that Western militaries understood. It showed conclusively that victory didn't always come from deploying bigger guns or dropping more bombs, but often from thinking just one step ahead of your enemy while under enormous pressure. The helmet on a stick trick certainly didn't end sniper warfare in the Pacific, and Marines would continue facing hidden shooters on every single island they fought for over the next 3 years. But it saved precious American lives when and where it mattered most, and it served as a powerful reminder to frontline soldiers that fear itself could be turned into an effective weapon if you took the time to understand where that fear actually came from and what fed it. The particular stretch of jungle where this deadly innovation first emerged eventually fell completely silent for good after the war ended, the resilient tropical trees growing back rapidly over abandoned foxholes and former firing positions, slowly hiding the physical scars of a vicious fight that once decided on a daily basis who would live and who wouldn't make it home. But the crucial lesson stayed alive, passed down through official after-action reports and unofficial stories told between veterans, because it captured the raw, unvarnished truth of what combat actually demanded from ordinary people. World War II wasn't only won by brilliant generals moving pins on maps or grand strategic plans developed in comfortable headquarters thousands of miles from the fighting, but by exhausted young men solving immediate deadly problems with whatever limited resources they happened to have in their hands at that exact moment. Even if that was nothing more than a spare helmet, a sturdy stick, and the raw courage to try something completely different when everything else had failed. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault. Next week, we're covering another moment where quick thinking and field innovation changed the fight in the Pacific. So hit subscribe and stay with us as we continue uncovering the hidden battles and forgotten innovations that shaped the war.